Hello and welcome to Connecting with the Stars with Mary Edwards. I'm so happy to have my special guest today, John Ramirez. Great to see you today, John. Happy to have you here.
Oh. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, well, thank you. And John has such an incredible background. I think I'm going to let him describe his 25 years in the CIA and all the incredible things that he did. And we'll talk about his own ET experience, his contact experience that he had as a young child, and sort of go through some of his incredible experiences he's had in his life and how he got to where he is today. So anyway, welcome aboard. And I'll just let you explain your bio a bit because it's absolutely fascinating, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure, Mary. I was a 25-year career veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1984 to 2009. And I worked in the Directorate of Science and Technology in what's known as the SIGINT, or Signals Intelligence field. And that is the collection of signals from foreign sources to analyze them and to understand the performance characteristics of certain weapon systems being transmitted from missile seekers or some radars that were associated with these weapon systems. So most of our early work was primarily against the Soviet Union, and later we added China. So that's not a secret. It's our two major adversaries. And also worked in the Directorate of Intelligence, which has now since been disbanded as a directorate and called something else, Director of Analysis. And what's significant about my work in the Directorate of Intelligence was that I was assigned to the Office of Scientific and Weapons Research, which later became known as WINPAC, WINPAC, Weapons Intelligence, Non-Proliferation, and Arms Control. Now, the significance of this was that these two offices were the successors of the original UFO office. At one time, at the time of Roswell, we had the Office of Research and Estimates, ORE, and within that office was the Scientific Intelligence Branch. And that office existed in the predecessor to CIA, which was called CIG. So then it was Central Intelligence Group. So when Roswell happened, there was no CIA. There was a Central Intelligence Group. And within that was the Scientific Intelligence Branch. And they're the ones who originally had the UFO portfolio. And that office, from a branch, grew into an entire larger office called the Office of Scientific Intelligence. And that was the office in place when a lot of the early sightings occurred, most notably the sighting over Washington, D.C. in July of 1952. And so—
Were you there for that? Were you there for that?
I was born in 1953.
Well, I was born in 51, so you were a little
So I missed that totally. But, you know, it's significant that it was this office that started this campaign of misinformation and disinformation. And misinformation is like, what's the difference? It's like, it's a modicum of truth, a little bit of truth there, seasoned with a lot of falsehoods. That's misinformation. You're misinformed. Disinformation is outright lies. And so they started that campaign for the public. So for internally, the CIA began a study in earnest of this phenomenon. And it was decided to make it kind of scary or threatening. So let's seed the public with this scary, threatening kind of scenario that we're being invaded by extraterrestrials. Mm-hmm. And you notice that the movies from 1952 onward had that theme. All the way to most recently, you have Independence Day. These scary extraterrestrials are coming to invade us.
You had War of the Worlds and the
War of the Worlds. Yeah. Well, even then, that was like H.G. Wells.
Yes.
Even before all of this happened. But you know, that was pretty much what Hollywood did. And prior to that incident in 1952, and prior to the Robertson panel starting, there were two movies made about UFOs. Most significantly, there was a movie released very early on, and I believe 1950, that was simply called The Flying Saucer. And the producer of that movie was working on another movie about Alaska. And while he was filming the movie about Alaska, he said that he witnessed these saucer type craft. And later, he wanted to make a movie about that because at that time, you know, you have the Arnold sighting from his aircraft, and then you have Roswell. So Roswell is still fresh in people's minds. And so he wanted to make a movie about flying saucers, and he did so. But in the course of making the movie, he claims that the government gave him film of actual flying saucers. That's his claim. And there's, of course, no way to validate that. But at the beginning of his movie called The Flying Saucer, he credited officials for making this movie possible. Now, what the movie is about? A flying saucer. And guess what that flying saucer was? An engineered craft by the American government. And then the following movie, which was well known, is The Day the Earth Stood Still, probably my favorite movie.
I've seen it 20 times. Yeah.
The original one. I would urge people to watch the 1951 original movie, which was filmed like just years after the Roswell events. So it's still fresh in the producers' minds and in the writers' minds, the folks who wrote this movie, still fresh. And what was the theme at the end of the movie? The very last dialogue from the visitor with his robot was very telling. He arrived because he said, our federation, our planets are concerned about your nuclear testing. The fact that you can destroy yourselves and ourselves. And so there's the two themes. Before the 52 Washington, D.C. sighting, you had one movie purportedly with U.S. government help about engineered craft. And the second movie was about the reason why they're here is because the concern over nuclear weapons. To me, that's true. You know, at that time, the government was telling you things through the entertainment industry that were true. But after 52, everything went toward the scary part and started this whole campaign that we're still living with, that, oh, we don't know who they are. We don't know where they come from. They're scary. It's this threat scenario that has been promulgated since then. And so I was in those offices. That was the successor to that original office that decided, let's make this scary. Let's completely deny the existence of the UFOs and the ETs. Let's disparage people who have sightings, and let's discourage any public interest in this subject matter. That happened in 52.
And where were you based, and how many people were there with you in that office? Were you in DC then, or where were you then?
Oh, yes. The Office of Scientific and Weapons Research, OSWR, is in headquarters building, in the original headquarters building. We call it OHB. That was the original building that was CIA headquarters from about 1959 on, when the ground was broken for it. Previously, CIA was on the Washington Mall grounds and temporary buildings, and also at a Navy facility on East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. And Alan Dulles, who was the director then, was scouting around for where he would want his permanent headquarters. And there was this wonderful parcel of land in Northern Virginia overlooking the Potomac River. And it was very palatial, and he wanted a campus-like setting for CIA. And I must say that CIA headquarters is in a very, very nice setting. It's absolutely beautiful setting with woods all around it, with walking trails around it. And they built a new headquarters called NHB, or New Headquarters Building. It's no longer new. It was built in the 80s. And so when you see a overhead photograph of the CIA headquarters, you'll see an original white-looking building that was originally there from 59. And then the 80s building is right behind it. And then you see the parking lots all around. So we were in there. And OSWR became Weapons Intelligence, Non-Proliferation, and Arms Control around about the time of the George W. Bush number 41 administration. And the compound is named after his father. It's called the George H.W. Bush Center for Intelligence. That's the formal name of CIA's facility.
Right. I was there, right? Not there, but George W. Bush went to Andover or in Yale with my brother-in-law, and he invited us to the White House while my brother-in-law was working as a lawyer in DC, and they were old friends. So we went in, and he was so very interesting. Wow. So how many people were actually in it? How many of there were you there at that time with putting all these, doing all this with this information and work then?
No, I would have to say that the OSWR and WINPAC did not do any kind of sort of activity like that. I have to preface this that CIA is not part of the Department of Defense. It is an independent intelligence agency. We provide one customer, the President of the United States, with intelligence, and he is the only customer of CIA. And then this customer, the President, will then designate other customers who he or she will allow to have the intelligence that he gets. So he gets the President's daily brief every morning, which is the most sensitive intelligence document in all of Washington, D.C. And below that, a layer below that, there's another document that's spread out. And I think it's called a Worldwide Intelligence Review or Report. We call it the WIRE, W-I-R with a small e. That's distributed to cabinet members and also to the major leaders in Congress. So the Gang of Eight, the most important people in Congress will get it. And so that's like the second, that's like the Speaker of the House and the heads of the Armed Services Committee for both House and Senate, and the heads of the Intelligence committees for both House and Senate. So the Gang of Eight will get that information as well. And then it filters down from there. And that is not as sensitive as what the President gets. That's what we do. We provide intelligence to the President. We are not involved in any kind, and I know it's controversial because people don't know what we do, but we're not involved in the disinformation and misinformation aspect of it in modern times, especially since the mid-70s, when we had congressional oversight from the House and Senate. So it curtailed a lot of what we could do. But that went over to the Department of Defense side, and I would conjecture to say that if there's any kind of misinformation or disinformation in this topic, it's coming out of the Pentagon, specifically out of the U.S. Air Force, and more specifically out of the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, because they have equities to protect. And what are those equities? The fact that there may be vehicles that were derived from the original source technology, that is whatever crashed or landed, and those vehicles are very sensitive, and they want to protect the existence of those vehicles. And any discussion of UFO topic, UAP topic, any opening of that will lead back to the fact that, oh, they're vehicles that we made. And people call them alien reproduction vehicles, or ARV. We are not able to reproduce the materials from which the original source technology came from. So we cannot make the metamaterials to the degree that we see the purities in the very basic elements making up that material. And so
because
you may
it's
have,
from over there, it's from outer.
well, it's the elements exist on Earth.
Right.
They're like magnesium, bismuth, and zinc. I mean, they're on Earth. There are no elements in there that is different from what's on Earth, but the way they manufacture these elements into the materials and the characteristics of the materials, we can't make it to the purity that the scientists are seeing. And some of that is coming out slowly, thanks to our dear friend Jacques Vallée. He's been very instrumental in getting this information out. And also, there have been some information coming from Doctors Hal Puthoff and Eric Davis, where they actually admitted in various forums that, yes, there are metamaterials, and yes, we have recovered metamaterials, and we have recovered crack. But you don't hear too much about that, because then all of a sudden that damper comes over that.
Right. Well, I mentioned to you too, and last time we spoke, that my dad was involved with his space company, and he traveled for a day with Werner von Braun in December 19th, 1951 to Area 51. It was very hush hush. He went back four or five more times, but he said they went down, many scared cases. It was very dark and hush hush. They had already been told to keep his trap shut his whole life, which he did.
Yeah.
But I've been talking to him, as I mentioned, through a medium to find out what went on really with some of those things that he couldn't talk about it during his life. He passed many years ago. But he just said it was always, all they said to us was, what's the material? How do we make it? How do we reproduce this? And it was fascinating to hear him talk about it the last few months. And so it's always been that way. I mean, wow. So you were really in the heart of it back then.
Well, I would say that I was never read into any kind of official UFO UAP program. But in the course of my work, what I did was the analysis of Soviet and then Russian radar signals that are able to track extremely fast objects in space. That in the course of the analysis of those signals, we did discover that they were tracking objects that were not their own missile tests, not our ballistic missiles, because there was no sneak attack against the Soviet Union or Russia from our missiles. They weren't tracking our missiles. They weren't tracking satellites. They were tracking something completely different. And so in the course of analyzing the radar signals, we noticed that they were putting track beams out and tracking something very fast. And then we get reports that it triggered an alarm within the strategic rocket forces. And they're the folks in Russia that actually control the intercontinental ballistic missiles. And the equivalent in the US is not strategic arms, strategic air command. That's long gone. It's not really STRATCOM, strategic command. That's still in place, but it's the Global Strike Command of the US Air Force. Global Strike Command is the equivalent to the strategic rocket forces. They're the folks that push the button, turn the keys. And so they put their missiles on high alert because they saw something that wasn't us, wasn't them, and wasn't anybody's satellite. So that, of course, got interest from the Pentagon. And so I was assigned to write a memorandum for the then Deputy Secretary of Defense. His name was John Deutsch. And so he got information from his own Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, which is what's known as a combat support agency of the Department of Defense. So they're more aligned to the Pentagon. CIA is independent. So we're like the second opinion for the Department of Defense. And so the question came like, what's going on? And so I wrote up this memorandum, which my partner in my office mate and I hand carried to the Deputy Secretary of Defense's office and provided it to his Chief of Staff for delivery to the Deputy Secretary. And in it, what I said, and it's classified, but I can say that I did not attribute anything to UFOs or UAPs because I had no evidence that that's what they were tracking. But I did rule out other things in that memorandum and also introduced the idea that it could have been a glitch in their testing. And I was looking at plausible explanations short of its UAPs, UFOs. But subsequent to that, we did get some open source information from within Russia that indeed they were using radars to not only track these vehicles, but also to lure them down to the ground, and that they would interact with these vehicles. For example—
how did they do that? With this radar or with light, or how do they do that?
They did it with the two devices mentioned in this open source from a Major General Alexeyev of the Russian Air Force were radars and these telescopes with laser beams on them, these instrumented telescopes. They would use these radars normally to track their own ballistic missile tests and also to be able to put a laser beam in furtherance of tracking these ballistic missiles under test. But they used these devices. It was ordered by the Soviet government way back when, under the Soviet Union, and continued under the Russian government. And he would describe that they would come down to the ground as like a ball of light, and they would interact with their arms and hands and whatever they did. And this ball of light would like flatten out to a disc, become a ball of light, or as a disc, they may turn according to what the observers on the ground did to it. So that sounds so fantastical. You say, this is probably just BS. You know,
That
this
makes
is,
sense. I mean, so you're talking, it was organic. So they were,
yeah,
it was responding to the motion or the whatever it
Right.
was that they were, and they
Right.
could, and then they'd fly away or whatever they did, right?
whatever they did with them. And I kind of know what they did. I kind of know what happened. But again, I've been asked by other interviewers, is there something that if you were in a SCIF, that is a sensitive compartment information facility, or intelligence facility, that would you say something to the other folks there who are also like with clearances that you can't say in the public? My answer always has been yes. And that yes refers to what exactly happened as a result of this early contact by the Russian government. So I can't disclose what happened after that, but it's very relevant. That's all I can say.
Makes sense. I mean, every night at the dinner table in the 50s, when I grew up, it was always the damn Russians, the Russians, the Russians. Then when Werner von Braun, they were all coming over. I guess he worked with Dad's company and many of them for many years. But it was so interesting. And then I told you he met Einstein when he was at Princeton, and then he worked on the Manhattan Project. And literally my whole childhood, he was, he wasn't there, and he was at White Sands. They were doing all the testing, and they got awards from Navy, Army. His brothers got, didn't have to go to war because of all the two companies they had were doing so much work with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't gotten into all the details. I'd love you to get on a call with my dad, but I mean, fascinating back then, because it was, I never really understood if that was straight up and all the control and the command and all the, basically the lies of disinformation. And
right. Yeah. Area 51, what we call Area 51, people look on the like Google Earth and see the airfield and the buildings around it. And that's generally called Area 51. It's an Atomic Energy Commission numbering designation. I always tell people, well, you heard of Area 51. How about Area 1 through 50 and 52 onward?
53, 54, people talk about.
What are those?
Yeah, right.
I happen to know that I happen to have been at one area beyond the 51 number, and which I can't talk about, but there are other areas of interest, and they were all associated with Atomic Energy Commission back then. And these areas were where they exploded above ground, and also on the ground and underground nuclear explosive devices. And so, above ground testing, that stopped in 1962. And the others have been underground, and now they're not testing any nuclear weapons whatsoever. We have no idea whether they work or not, but there are ways that the Los Alamos National Labs, there are ways that they can take some of the materials from a weapon and test it with lasers, hitting it with lasers, watching it scatter, and they say, oh yeah, an event happened, and we think that the weapon is still viable. We haven't tested a nuclear weapon from a missile since 1962, and that only happened once. And that was a submarine-launched ballistic missile fired by the USS Ethan Allen in 1962, carrying a live nuclear warhead. It was launched from under the sea, and then and exploded as it should, as it was designed, further downrange, like thousands of miles away. And so that was the only one and only nuclear weapons test ever in the history of the United States, which required a missile to deploy that nuclear weapon. Most have been static. That is, you have the what's known as the physics package on the ground, and then they detonate it to make sure it worked. And they say, oh, that's a good design. You know, we'll put that in a weapon that we'll deploy.
People know about that?
They should. And I'm telling you now.
Okay.
You can look it up.
We should know
Right.
everything over the last 7 years.
And so,
wow.
again, the point being is that Area 51 is popularly known as that airfield. But what people should look at is something called R, like in Romeo, the number 4808, R 4808. And that is a restricted airspace area. And in that area, restricted airspace, you have the Edwards Air Force Base, you have Groom Lake, you have China Lake, and other facilities where we test advanced aircraft. And so when people say, yeah, it's at Area 51, I happen to know people who've been at Area 51, and they said there's nothing there that's interesting. What we did use Area 51, when CIA had it, we didn't call it that. We call it Station D, as in Delta, Station D. We worked on our own aircraft starting in 1955, the U-2 and the A-12, which is the precursor to the SR-71. And they were silver. And so when we fly these in broad daylight, because the cameras only worked in daylight, they were not night vision cameras back then, we had to be able to see our own aircraft, and they would see streaks of silver, the citizens did, flying over the air. They compared that to our flight plans for these aircraft and had a correlation. But 10% of what people saw did not correlate to our aircraft flying at 70,000 feet plus. And so those 10% were the actual, like, unidentified flying objects, the real UFOs. And so that was briefed to me by the CIA historian, who looked back into the records and say, yeah, there were about 10% of what people reported were not ours, were not Russian. It was real UFOs. And that people in government, maybe the Office of Special Investigations from the Air Force, they visited the people who witnessed this and who reported it to the local press. And so the early UFO organizations back then, they existed. And so they would get that visit. And so maybe that is the legend of the Men in Black. And so we call it Station D. And what we did was we built our aircraft. We also exploited Soviet aircraft that we acquired, and they were delivered to Area 51, which we call Station D, and it was in the hangars. And we were able to fly those and then developed actual real world models of how to fly against them in combat. And so there were foreign aircraft in there being exploited, but there were not saucers when CIA was there. So 1959 to 79, we left in 1979. No CIA at Area 51 since 1979. It was turned over to the Air Force, Edwards Air Force Base Flight Test Center, Detachment 3, and they took over. And I can't tell you what's in there. I don't know, because everything in there is highly compartmented under the Department of Defense. So whether they have craft there now, I can't say yes or no. I can say that when CIA was there, there were no UFOs, quote unquote, at Area 51. They were exploited somewhere else, and probably with the Air Force.
But they have gone to Wright-Patterson. Because my dad he had 8 huge companies in Chicago, and most of them were near Chicago here, near military bases. But when he was building like 150,000 square foot unit right at next door in the area of Wright-Patterson. And I haven't had a chance to really talk to him about all that. They were hangars. It was huge, and it was right there. And so I know he's sort of, we've talked about a lot of other things, but we haven't really gotten into that. But wouldn't you, because I know since Area 51 didn't house a lot of them, did they maybe take them to Wright-Patterson? Or, I mean, people
So the UFO lore, and we have Colonel Philip Corso to thank for this. He did state that, they went to the Air Force, and back then it was the Army Air Force, which shortly became the U.S. Air Force, and Wright-Patterson, then called Wright Field, acquired the craft and or materials, and perhaps the bodies themselves. And they went to what's known as, back then, T2 intelligence. T as in Tango, 2 intelligence, T2 intelligence, which became ATIC. It's the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson, ATIC. And ATIC was the predecessor for what most people know as FTD, the Foreign Technology Division, which is now the National Air and Space Intelligence Center. And so going back to then, to T2 intelligence, they probably did acquire that because it was at T2 intelligence where we brought over all of the German advanced technology for study. And at Wright-Patt, it's the home for what's known as FMAE, Foreign Material Acquisition and Exploitation. FMAE, that's actually a term, FMAE. Wow. And that's where they did all of that for anything that we acquire of a foreign nature that flies. It goes there. And then as far as developing anything from there, Wright-Patt doesn't have the capability to manufacture anything. They have the capability to study things, but if you want to like exploit it for further manufacture of our own stuff, it will have to go somewhere else. And well, so where that's
yeah, and Dad had huge. It was the largest cold storage of anywhere in the world at the time. They were doing the blimps with Boeing. They were doing, working with. I really would love to get you on a call with him someday. You guys might be able to talk about it. But I mean, it went from, and it was 52, 53, 54. It grew and grew and grew and grew. And they had, as I mentioned, they had 400 scientists and people on staff to be able to go out to the field to study and talk about things. And Dad said he and Werner von Braun talked a few times about the dead bodies and some of the materials and where they went. And I mean, I'm just starting to put the pieces together because I've just been learning about this all last months because I reached out to him through this medium that I talked to, and it's just been mind blowing. But it makes sense that all, I mean, because he's talked a little bit about it, but wouldn't that make sense? I mean, because there wasn't, because
I think early on it did. I would say later on it does not.
Where does it go later on? Where did
I would love to know. I can only speculate where it went later on. But I'll give you some clues. If you have bodies, you need a forensics lab with pathologists, physiologists, biologists, all of the life sciences. You need some kind of laboratory environment that's sterile, so you don't want to introduce our germs to whatever specimens under study. So you need something that's very sterile. And so you'll have to look at where do we have those kind of facilities where you can isolate an organism from somewhere else that isn't Earth, from somewhere else. And the only clue I found, and again, for your audience, I don't know, but I know where to look for clues. And that place is Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. And Dugway Proving Ground is huge. And using the proverbial comparison, it's like Rhode Island underneath the ground. So you see some structures above the ground, which is the actual Dugway Proving Ground under the U.S. Army. But underneath are laboratories. And it's known as a BSL-3 facility. For it's the biological security level, biosecurity, hazard level number 3. So they can keep things there. Now, NASA designated Dugway to be the site where anything astrobiological that NASA might find, not on Earth, anything astrobiological will be sent to Dugway. So that's just a clue of where it might be as far as storage, because you need to plumb someplace where you can store something that won't get contaminated by us and won't contaminate, that they won't contaminate us and vice versa. So it's like a very secure facility. It's not up to the level of BSL-4, which is the CDC, but we do have CDC facilities like that. But Dugway is under Army control, under the Department of Defense control, and it is certified by NASA to be an astrobiological collection site. So that's just a clue. As far as the hardware goes, I can say that 1948, less than a year after Roswell, there was a major shifting in the National Procurement Act for military hardware. To procure military hardware, we were operating under a World War II kind of provision. But now in 1948, Congress wanted it more formalized, and they decreed that, you know, any kind of contract between it was no Department of Defense then, contrary to popular belief. It's called the National Military Establishment. And the National Military Establishment could enter into contracts with companies, but these contracts had to be public. They had to be publicized as open source. But in the fine print of this Procurement Act, 1948, a year after Roswell, were provisions to have certain national security contracts hidden. They actually made into law, made it legal to have the early nascent versions of our unacknowledged SAPs, of our wave SAPs back then. So when people say that these are illegal, I say, oh, it's 1948, Congress made it legal, it was signed by the president. So your representative said it's legal, and the president agreed and made it into law, and it's been into law ever since, most notably with President Obama. He actually started this, formalized these unacknowledged SAPs and these wave SAPs in his executive order 13526. So it's President Obama that says it's okay to have these wave SAPs. It's okay to have these unacknowledged SAPs. And in his executive order, it delineated who can be read into those SAPs. So don't tell me it's not legal, because it's stood the test of time. And any lawyer out there who claims that it's illegal, it's unconstitutional, well, I encourage them to make a federal case out of it and take it to the Supreme Court, where you will lose, because the structure of these wave SAPs, these unacknowledged SAPs, were created under U.S. code, the law of the land. And it's all built into U.S. code, which is the law of the land. So you can make an argument that it's not constitutional. So it's legal, but something legal doesn't mean it's constitutional. So you can say this is unconstitutional, and that's a good argument to have, and see how far you get into the federal court system to see if you can get it to the Supreme Court. So I think these programs are out there. You hear bits and pieces, a little, you know, this information and that information. You hear a little bit about, yeah, there are materials, yeah, there are craft. And I'm hoping that in the years to come, maybe in the months to come, that more of that will be disclosed. So
we hope so. It's time. It is really time, right, isn't it?
Right. And the reason why I say that is I believe that whatever the Air Force did with its contractors, if it's like government furnished property or government furnished equipment going to the contractor, you can transfer something from the government to a contractor, and the contractor will then can develop proprietary technology from it and then sell it back to the government. And that's just the way it works. So I think, you know, if there's anything that was built, it's probably with our defense contractors out on the West Coast. And I think that if it's there, we, the government, may take a hands-off approach, because it's proprietary technology, and we do not have oversight over a proprietary technology. And if they develop it under their own funds, we do not hold oversight how they spend their own money. But if a penny of taxpayers' money went to developing what's flying, let's call them, for lack of a better term, triangles, our triangles versus their triangles. If our triangles were built with taxpayer money, we do have oversight over that. And if they're hiding it from oversight, then I would say maybe that's not legal. And Congress has some oversight responsibilities. And what you're seeing now is Congress, the Senate and the House, Armed Services Committees and the Intelligence Committees providing that oversight, which is their duty to do on behalf of the American people, to have oversight. And they're calling to task the officials who know about any kind of arrangement like this before Congress to reveal more information. Of course, Do they tell us in open session? No, it will be under closed session. I just want to point out to your viewers that when we had Mr. Bray and Mr. Moultrie in the previous hearing, Mr. Moultrie was the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and Mr. Bray was the heading at that time the UAP task force. And when he testified, he was then the Deputy Director of Office of Naval Intelligence. So these two principal people appeared before the House Committee for, I think it's the C3 committee, which is concerned with counterterrorism, counterproliferation, and counterintelligence. And that subcommittee, when they appeared, they were not sworn in. You can replay any YouTube video or anything going back, look at them appear before and sitting at the table, and that started with them never standing up and being sworn in. What does that mean?
Yeah, right.
Do they have to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but
the truth? No.
No.
Wow.
And they mince their words very carefully. That's one thing when you listen to us, and when I say us, I include me as a former government person.
Mhm.
We parse our statements very carefully. So we listen to the question and we only answer your question without adding anything to our answer. And so keeping in mind that the UAP task force was responsible from November 12, 2004 until current times. That's all they studied. And they only studied military sightings. That's all they studied. So what happened on November 12, 2004? Tic Tac. That was the Tic Tac date. So they only went back to Tic Tac until the present time. And the second version of the report, which was released earlier this year, they went from where that left off to the current time where the report was written. So right now we're just getting here's what we see in the last year. So when they were asked about Maelstrom Air Force Base and the incident where some Minuteman missiles were taken offline, they said that we don't have that. Now, were they lying? No. What they're saying is the UAP task force, we being the UAP task force, did not have that information. And that's true because they did not look at that information. They didn't need to. So people say, oh, they were lying. No, they were telling the truth. The UAP task force did not have that information. And that's the absolute truth. So Congress, very upset about that, wanted more. They should have followed up with more questions. But what they did was, in the current legislation, they went back to what year? January 1st, 1945. And so that incorporated more years, and that incorporated a very important event. Again, thanks to Paula Harris and Jacques Vallée, they wrote the book about Trinity, that event. That will incorporate the Trinity event, which again, Trinity, yes, that's where the first atomic weapon was detonated. It was the implosion device that was dropped over Nagasaki, not Hiroshima. They knew the Hiroshima weapon would work. That's what's known as a gun device. But the implosion device was much more sophisticated, and they needed to see if that would work, and it did. And so that was what was deployed against Nagasaki. So that event, the Trinity UFO event, and the recovery of those materials occurred in 1945. So they will cover that in subsequent, I think, hearings.
How fascinating. My dad, when I was talking to him the other day, I said, what are you researching now up there? And he says the government's, the people still ask him a lot of questions. He said, I'm still trying to figure out World War II. He was, lieutenant pilot in the Aleutians, and he was there. And then he, and that's when he met Oppenheimer and different people and started a little bit secret space stuff on the side. But fascinating. I mean, you're such a wealth of information, and you are Japanese. You must have been really interested in all of this as well, right?
Well, being Japanese, when I was a little kid, I left Japan at 5 years old. I didn't know there was a World War II. And I didn't know there was a place called America. I was just a Japanese kid and only spoke Japanese. So all of that was, ambivalent to me until I arrived in America. And then I think that time, that's when I first experienced racism.
Ugh, well,
Because, when I arrived in America, the war had been completed just 14 years or 13 years prior.
mm.
So it's like recent memory. And so that's when I first encountered this anti-Asian kind of prejudice.
And where did you move? And what was your family like? I mean, if we have a little while left, but I could talk to you forever. This is fascinating. Your stories are incredible. So when you came here, where did you move in America? And I'd love to hear about a bit of your first contact that you had.
Right.
Were your parents into that too? Did they have any experiences or contact themselves?
Not a contact themselves that I know of. I can say that, I arrived in 1958, and I was at that time 5 years old, and I lived with my father's family, which would be my paternal grandmother and cousins and aunts and uncles from that family in San Antonio, Texas.
Mhm.
And I was there for a brief period of time. My mother was still in Japan. Then we moved to Petersburg, Virginia, where there is a army base there called Fort Lee. I believe that's going to be changed because of its association with General Lee. So whatever name that will be, I don't know yet. But I lived there in Petersburg, Virginia, and that's where I had my first sighting that I saw playing with my cousins and our playmates there in base housing. Over the right side of where the base housing was, over the woods, I saw this silver shaped kind of oval craft rise up above the forest woods. And there was no gondola underneath, like a blimp, with any propellers or any kind of motion. There were no markings on it. It was just a silver kind of like, I guess you would call it a giant tic tac, it's just big, kind of shaped like that, rising above. And it
How big
drifted
did you think
off.
it was? How big would you guess it was, or couldn't tell?
I couldn't tell. But it wasn't a little toy balloon. It was not a hobbyist balloon, believe me. It was a craft of some sort. And my cousins, I pointed to it, said, there it is, there it is. My playmates, they couldn't see a thing. There's nothing there for them. It was just shown to me. So that was my first encounter with a craft. But I've had other encounters as well. But going back to my father's family, my father told me that his grandmother, which would be my great-grandmother, was a Cherokee Indian. She was full-blooded Cherokee, and that she left the Cherokee Nation in order to marry my great-grandfather, who was Spanish. And so she left. But when she used to tell stories about Atlantis, that she said to my father, Atlantis is very important to the Cherokee people. And it was a place that existed in ancient times that had these advanced technologies. And that they had like the ability to do to fly in the sky, and all of these, what we would call advanced technology now, or current technology now, they had back then. And my father just told me, now this is something that your great-grandmother told me, says my father. And so I never connected it until much later, when I found out that under hypnosis, QHHT, quantum healing hypnosis technique, as created by Dolores Cannon and her protocol, and now practiced by a protege. Her name is Sarah Brexman Cosme. That in her practice, not knowing anything about this, that her clients under QHHT started relating experiences of themselves in Atlantis. And that these people, her clients, were being visited and had experiences themselves with the phenomena. So is there a connection? There might be.
Absolutely.
There might be. So
I've had many regressions, and I was a doctor in Atlantis and an architect. And I mean, it's fascinating to go back, but that's unbelievable. What a beautiful blend of history you have woven in. And so, and do you know how far back it goes beyond that? Because I know my grandfather, I've been researching, it was my dad got it, my mom's grandfather had the wiring, and then my dad's grandfather and grandfather and grandfather. I'm tracing it back more
Yes,
now.
yes,
94
way
generations. Back. It's really from 0 AD to now. So it's almost 100 generations in my family that I've been tracking with many different people the last 3 years. Is just mind blowing. It's so cool. It's so
it would surprise me that it goes back to BCE as well. I mean, they may go way back. And so that's a fascinating area to explore. But I'm kind of a person that here I am now, and it's not where I came from that's important, it's where I'm going. I have that kind of philosophy of life.
Me too. So, I'm all about the future.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm hoping for a post-disclosure future where what we're talking about now doesn't sound so strange. That we need to like.
We need to normalize it. It is
exactly.
It has been happening. We know it from art. We've looked at it. I was an art history major 50 years ago. We saw it, and I've been to Stonehenge when I was 8 years old. I mean, I've been to Peru. I've been all over the planet and off planet a lot. And it is time for just the truth, and the truth is coming. We are the disclosure. All of us are the disclosure. We're still going to get drip, drip, drips. And do you think we have hope then that we'll get little pieces along the way?
I would think you get more than little pieces. I can only speak for myself. My encounters have been positive.
Mine too.
I've been brought up gradually throughout my life from my previous experiences to do what I'm doing now. And it seems that I was being prepared for some kind of work that I'm doing now to help others understand what's going on through both personal experiences and my professional life. I was in a position to know things. And I think that official disclosure will be happening real soon now. And I want to applaud Steve Bassett, whom we all know and love. I
spent 3 hours with him. I missed you.
He now says months, not years.
Yes, everyone's saying months. We had a long talk about that. It's about to explode. You can feel it because the shift in the frequency, everything is happening so quickly now. And I know too, for me, I'm speaking at New Life Expo next week, and I've been really tracking all my history all the way back. I had been groomed for this my whole life with my galactic family. I know my father was an engineer, worked at NASA, worked with NASA, the government, the military. And my grandfather and his father started their company in 1893, and back and back and back. And I've been tracking it really since I was in Boulder at age 16. And I know my dream was just to work at NASA. And I wasn't an engineer, and I was a female in the 50s who forget it. But I got my BFA, my interior design degree. I went to architecture. I did everything I could, and I was lucky enough to work as a contractor, just only for a few years, many years ago. And then I've been off planet teaching kids, and I have thousands of hybrid children. I mean, they've been training me, grooming me, helping me, supporting me. And as I've mentioned to you, I think a little bit, that I was in programs from age 3 to 10 in some labs, some robotics, some ritual stuff, 20 to 30 electromagnetic shock things. But I am eternally optimistic that I now know I can do anything. Now that I've had the validation from my father and my grandfather, up until this morning, I was talking to Dad through my medium, and because I can't do that. I've always known that I didn't fit here from the day I was born, and that I was here on a different mission. And I've been on a mission my whole life. And all I want to do is help expose and support people. Oldies like me, I just turned 72, and I don't know anything. I'm just at the tip of the iceberg. And I want to help open the doors and get the fear, turn the fear into education, turn the fear and the control and command into the positivity to help teach our children well, to give them the skills and the knowledge and the opportunities. I mean, even when my daughter worked at NASA, for Dr. Von Clearwater, my old boss, she worked there for several years, a few years ago. She said it was just, and right before Von retired, but she said, I mean, I would go down and we were teaching kids. It was, Moffett Field's near me here in San Francisco, where I used to work out of. And then we worked down at Johnson Space Center a bunch for a couple of years doing the full-size mock-up that I was bugging them for 3 years to do, so we could test pupillary dilation different kind of really effects of how long-term and isolation and confinement would be. And we did a lot of studies. It was fascinating.
Mhm.
But it is time. It is our time. It is everyone's
Yes.
time. We really deserve to know. We need
Right.
to know, and we should know.
Right.
And I lived like a freak. I mean, I thought I was crazy most of my life. I mean, my dad during his lifetime was told not to speak. And,
Yes.
just in the last year, I finally am not in fight or flight. And I'm here to help others and just to tell my little story. I'm still learning. I don't know how I know everything, but I know a lot and I don't know anything, but I want, I'd love to have you back to tell more of your stories. I mean, you're just fascinating,
Well,
John.
thank you very much. I just want to close with this. To your point about where can the government help? And one of the most frightening things that you can hear in the English language is, I am from the government and I'm here to help. And that's when you run away. But I think the government can help. And I think right now they're being coy with statements. And have you heard this? Oh, they're not a foreign adversary, but they're not ours, but we don't know where they came from. We don't know what they are or where they came from. I believe your government does know that what has been detected in space and in our skies, that we have in our possession, what we have in our possession was not built by humans and not flown by humans, that the builders of this technology originated from other planets. And I use the word plural, planets, because there have been more than one non-human intelligences who are visiting the Earth. So the Greys, most people focus on Greys, but there are others. And just because
I mean, there are hundreds of species.
Right.
We don't even know, and they're multiverses. I mean, it's so narrow-minded to think that they're only a reptilian and a gray and bad guys. I mean,
yes.
the Palladians, the Arcturians, people, they're right here with me, supporting me, or I probably wouldn't be here from what I've been through in childhood. I mean, there are many, just like us. There are the bad dudes on our planet, and there are a few bad dudes up there, but we see the positivity, what we've shared, what we've learned from them, and take that and use it to for our children, our grandchildren, for the future, instead of hiding it and controlling it for use and money and greed and more of the patriarchal stuff, control and command that we've grown up with, you and I have, being about the same age. So I love that. I love your openness too. So you're a positive person like I am, and we just want the best for our future, for everyone, for all of us.
Absolutely. There's every year the atomic scientists have this clock, and they have a few minutes, when nuclear annihilation might occur based on all the events that happened during the past year. And I think if there's a disclosure clock, let's say there's a metaphorical disclosure clock that strikes at 12 when disclosure starts, we're just a minute or two from that point. And I'll leave you with that teaser.
I would love it. We're a breath away. So let's ask for it right now. Let's ask for it.
Let's manifest this. Let's manifest this.
Let's really manifest.
Let's make it happen.
Let's make it happen. Let's just shoot for May 1st, May Day. Why not just pick a day, May 11th or something? Just pick a time, and we're going to manifest that. And we should just spread the word and just say, let's open the doors, pull the veil all the way back. We need a full Monty now of information. Anyway, you are just a gem. Thank you so much for being here today, and I hope you'll come back.
Well, thank you. And I'm looking forward to having future talks with you and with your audience.
All righty. Well, thanks again, and have a lovely day. Be kind to each other, everyone, and keep your minds opened for all the positive things that are going to happen now and in the future.